Okay, so most of you did the week 3 quiz. I think I got 32 submissions, which is good. I should probably ask. Let me break the chat window open. How are you finding the quizzes? Too hard, too easy, just right? Are they kind of a fair summary of what we're learning? They're fine. Okay. All right. In the past, I did the quizzes as fill in the blank. So you had to get the answer matching exactly. And I got some feedback from students saying they really didn't like the fill in the blank format. It was much more difficult. So I've been redoing the quizzes this semester and moving it to multiple choice instead. I think it is a little bit easier, maybe not quite as good of a test, make sure you're learning, but I guess the point is people are doing them, and the idea is just that you're getting that regular review um, each week. So here's our plan for today. So we're going to go over assignment 1B. I've given you quite a bit more time to do this. Lots of time, and pretty much everything you're going to need for assignment 1B, we're going to go over in class today, with the possible exception of deployment. And if we don't get to that today, we'll get to that next week. I think on the syllabus, originally it was actually due next week. In truth, a week is enough time to do the assignment. But I'm going to give you guys I'm going to push it back and give you all of reading week as well. Okay, so we have class this week, we have class next week, and then I've updated the syllabus as well. So it's now due Monday, October 19th. So that's 20 days to do this, which is tons of time. It's lots of time to set up your database and get CRUD operations working in your application. So we'll go over that in a minute. We're going to start looking at SQL Server. I know some of you have worked with it before, probably some of you haven't. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. We want to set up our beer store database. So I think last week I did set it up locally. I'm also going to show you the process of setting up the database on Azure. I know, again, some people have gone through it before, but I will walk through that process again. My recommendation is for the beer store application, you probably want to use a local database. It's going to run faster and won't use any of the resources in your Azure account. But it's important you know how to set up and connect to an Azure database, because that's what you're going to need to use in your assignment. So we're going to look at this .NET object called DB context, which is used for connecting to databases. We're going to plan out what our beer store database is going to look like. And then we're going to use this .NET tool called database migrations. So we're going to create models in our beer store application and then use the migrations to automatically generate matching tables in the database. Once we have that set up, we're going to use Visual Studio scaffolding tools to auto-generate controllers and views. And once we do that, you're basically going to have everything you need for assignment 1B. The only thing not in this list is actually deploying the web application to Azure. As I said, if we don't have time this week, we will definitely do that next week. Okay, so there's the plan. So if you want to have a look at assignment 1B, that's in the assignments tab. I'm going to open up and share the document. And we can go over it. Okay, so again, I've moved the due date from the 5th to the 19th. I've given you 2 more full weeks. This is the biggest part of the assignment. It's worth 15% of your grade. We've already done part A. I got some really creative, some really good ideas, which is great. So for part B, you basically just need to submit 2 things. Submit the same link you already gave me. You don't need to make a new repository. Just give me the same repository link you already submitted for part A. And then you're going to give me the link to the live website. That should run on Azure. Now, I will also give you an alternative if you don't have Azure. If you absolutely cannot get things running on Azure, you can build a local assignment. but it's not preferred because it's more difficult for you to submit the assignment, and it's more difficult and more time consuming for me to mark it. So ideally, everyone's assignments are going to be published to the internet, not just running locally. And as I go through this, if at any point you've got a question, feel free to ask with your mic on or use the chat. Right? Your project has to be independent, so you're not sharing work or sharing code or doing the project together with someone else. Everyone's grade is individual. Okay? If I get any projects that are not independent, the minimum penalty is a grade of 0 on the assignment. Okay? And if I suspect your project is the same as someone else's, we're going to have a code review meeting where you'll have your camera and your mic on, and you'll be asked to explain any of the work that you've submitted to verify that it's your own and you understand it. You can use the beer store repository that I've been publishing each week. You can use it as a reference, but you can't just download it, make changes to it, and give it to me as your assignment. You have to make a brand new application of your own. If you want to use any third-party code, you can do so with these rules. Number one is that you cite it, where the code came from. Number two, it can't be more than 10% of your code. So you can't just go find a tutorial with the full source code, copy all the source code, and submit it as your project. And the last thing is, if you want to use third-party code, please email me a link, explain what it is you want to use so I can check it and just make sure that I give it the okay. And that will get around any concerns about, am I allowed to use this code in my project, yes or no? As long as you get it approved, it's not more than 10% of your project, and you include a link to where it came from, then yes, you can use code that you find somewhere else. So the basics of this project are to set up a new web application. You're going to use the same options that we've used for the beer store. So you're going to enable individual user accounts for authentication. You're going to enable HTTPS. And you're going to create a new .NET Core MVC web application. So exactly what we've already done twice now in class. You're going to set up and connect to an SQL Server database. We're going to do this today. You're going to generate model classes that you need for your assignment. And then you should use migrations to build the tables. You can build the tables manually if you want to, but using the migrations just saves time and helps ensure accuracy. And then you can use the Visual Studio scaffolding tools. Those tools will automatically generate functional controllers and views for you. So you actually have to write very, very little code to get this working. So this is just kind of in the details. You're going to set up your application. You need to have at least 2 models in your project and at least 2 tables in the database. And there has to be at least one-to-many relationships. So you can't just have 2 tables that are completely independent. So, your tables might be something like players and teams, where one team has many players and one player belongs to one and only one team. So you'll have to decide what relationships the tables have based on what application you're going to build. And we'll look at how we set up these relationships in the models today. You'll then use the MVC scaffolding to build your controllers and views. And these controllers will automatically contain all the create, read, update, and delete methods. You don't have to write those methods yourself. You can modify them to work the way you want them to work, but you will get working code with a working set of views for all the CRUD operations. You then need to modify your site a little bit. You'll need to change the links in the nav bar. As we've seen, the template we get in Visual Studio, it just contains a link to home and a link to privacy. So you'll need to link to your new controllers in the nav bar. And then you'll need to add a descriptive title in the header, and in your footer, you're going to put your name, your student number, and our course name and code. Finally, on the home page, you're going to take out the boilerplate text that Visual Studio gives us, and you're going to replace that with some description of what your website is. So when somebody first clicks and comes to the home page, they know what it is they're looking at. You're going to commit to GitHub regularly. So I'd like to see a minimum of 4 commits on at least 2 calendar days. You have 3 weeks to do this. I keep saying it's tons of time. You'll want to make sure you have a Visual Studio Git ignore so the dependencies don't get included in your repository. And lastly, you'll publish your site to Azure. This works quite well. Azure supports continuous deployment from GitHub. So we'll look at this functionality either this week or next week. So we can push our code repository to GitHub, and then we can connect our Azure website to the GitHub repository. The way this works with Azure's continuous deployment options is Azure checks your repository every 60 seconds for a new commit. So anytime we push changes, those changes will automatically get deployed to the production web server. And a couple options for bonus marks. You can customize the style of your site. You could go and find a theme to add on, a third-party theme, or you could do your own CSS. Lastly, I'll add another bonus for any other independent learning that you show with .NET Core. So if you want to add additional functionality to the site that's .NET related, not JavaScript or CSS or HTML related, but something new in .NET Core that you've learned on your own, I'll give you a bonus mark for that. You must tell me in the README feature what the bonus feature is, though, because I won't necessarily know what to look for. So here's the rubric, a couple marks for your database, and the bulk of the marks are for your models, views, and controllers. So the models, you're going to create the controllers and views. Visual Studio is going to create these for you. Changing the links, version control, a couple marks for deployment. So as I said, you don't have to deploy to Azure, but if you don't, those are a couple marks that you aren't going to have. And then a couple of bonus marks, the layout and other bonus functionality. So when you submit this, you will have a working .NET Core web application where users can create, read, update, and delete data. This is the goal for this part of the assignment. Does anybody have any questions? Anything that needs clarification? Yes, so for full marks, there are 2 marks for deploying it. So again, I'll go over either this week or in the start of next week's class, I'll show you how to deploy to Azure. I know we'll also talk about Azure credits. I know one of the students in the class had an issue today saying that their Azure credits were used up. So I'll show you a workaround for that. And I will also show you if you absolutely can't get Azure, but you want to deploy to a production server, I can recommend a fairly inexpensive, not free, but inexpensive host. I think they charge $5 US a month for a .NET site. But I would like your applications to be deployed. It means I can grade them online without having to download them. It also means it's something you can show potentially in a job interview if your site is deployed online. Yeah, I will explain how you can basically get another Azure for Students account. Are there other questions about the assignment in terms of what I'm asking, what the requirements are, what you need to do? Yes, that was the work. That was workaround A. We can try workaround B as well. Yep, thanks, Braden. That can be an option. The trick will be, that's right, that I don't know that, I think you could use Google Cloud, but I think you might have to set up your own Microsoft server stack. It is possible to do on AWS as well. You can get free AWS credits with the AWS Educate program. I did have a student do this last year, but I think he had to set up his own stack that ran .NET and SQL Server. So he did it and it worked. But Azure is the simplest alternative if you're able to get it working. Are there other questions about the assignment requirements? Well, the deployment is 2 marks out of the 24. So you can still get a grade over 90% without deploying, but to get full marks, yes, I would like to see it deployed because I think it's important that building. It's great if you can build an application in .NET, but if you can't deploy it, that's part of the whole process that you would need to undergo. Well, as I said, I will provide another possible workaround. I can't guarantee that it will work, but I will suggest it and someone can try it and let me know if it works. Okay, so you can find the assignment on D2L. And again, it's due on the 19th at 5 o'clock. I would expect nobody should be late with this because I've given you far, far, far more time than you need to do this. Okay. So I'm actually going to pause the recording. I know a few of you have been extremely motivated, good for you, and have already kind of gone through this. So rather than me play this video, I think what I'll do is just pause. This is just a 9-minute kind of introduction to SQL Server. Now I know that a lot of you have seen it very briefly I think in your C# course, you may have worked with SQL Server a little bit, probably not nearly to the detail we're going to be working with it in this course. So what I'd like you to do is watch the quick video. And as you're watching, I want you to think about why would you use SQL Server? So this links to this discussion board thread. I think 3 of you have already completed this activity. So if you did, feel free to go take a few minutes and grab a coffee. So I'm going to give you about 15 minutes for this because the video is 9 minutes. And so what I want you to do is watch the video, start a new thread, and explain why we're going to use this database technology. Okay, so we'll come back at about 2:35. I'll stay in the room, but I'm going to stop my screen share and my recording until we come back. We'll just resume the recording. So what was maybe one takeaway you had from the video about the value of SQL Server and why we would want to use it? Why don't we just use MySQL for everything in this course? Yep. So number one, that's thanks, Nick. Absolutely. The integration, they're both Microsoft products. It's kind of the standard database for working with .NET. What are maybe a few other reasons that we would use SQL Server? Yep, it's got a lot of security. I mean, it's designed as an enterprise level solution, so we've got lots of options for uh, controlling access. That's right, Leo. Maybe a couple other reasons, and any other takeaways you had from the video about why SQL Server is useful for us. Well, that's an interesting point, Braden. I mean, what does he talks about SQL Server licenses in the video. Yep, there is a lot of customization. What does he say about the licensing? So this is actually a good reason why SQL Server is valuable. Anybody catch what he said about it? Yeah, the integration, Leo, for sure. Okay.
The ability to get to it really fast. Enterprise level databases like Oracle need SQL Server database, and often inexpensively when it's still quite rare to find other enterprise level databases like Oracle.
You got it. So most web hosting companies, if you want to create a database on a shared host, most web hosting companies are going to give you two choices. They're going to let you create a MySQL database, or they're going to let you create an SQL Server database. That's basically it. So if you go to a company like GoDaddy, for example, those are the only options they give you. And Braden, coming back to your point, the point is you don't need, if you're using a shared server, you don't need to pay for an SQL Server license. You can rent space on a hosting company and they've already paid for the license. So you can use their license in order to deploy an SQL Server database. So that's what he's talking about in the hosted solution that Stella is mentioning. You're right. So if you don't want MySQL, with most hosting companies, SQL Server is your other option. Okay. So there are some other good reasons that he mentions. So sort of your class activity for the week is to post in the discussion thread. A number of you have done that already, but you may want to take some time to go back over the video and just post an answer in there sometime before next week. Okay. Also, just put up a link here. So how popular is SQL Server? So these are current stats. There's all sort of metrics around database systems. It's current from this month. So right now, according to these metrics, SQL Server is one of the big three. So Oracle, MySQL, and SQL Server, the three most popular database engines out there. And this order hasn't really changed for several years. You can see the big three, they really dwarf any of the other databases, at least according to these metrics. So widely used. Now, when you used SQL Server in your other course, I guess in your C# course, was that with Tom? I'm just trying to get a sense of how much you worked with it. How many lessons did you do working with SQL Server? Okay, one assignment. Okay, thanks, Leo. All right, so it's not brand new, but probably you haven't done a lot with it. Okay, so what I want to go through is kind of the setup, both locally. I mean, we did do it locally, but I'll go over it again and I'll show you how to set up a database in the Azure portal. And then we'll look at, once we have it set up and running, how do we connect our web application to it? Okay. So we know that it's going to integrate well. It's going to be the default database of choice for .NET. So I went through the process last week of setting up a local database. I'm going to go through it again locally, and then we'll also look at setting it up for Azure. Then we're going to configure it and generate tables from our models and then scaffold controllers and views. So that's what we want to do today. So the link to that video is in the slides as well. These slides are also on D2L in the week 4 folder. So the first thing we need to do to get a database running locally, we need to install SQL Server, which I asked you to do last week. We also need to make sure that it's running. One of the things that a few people may have missed, so in the email I sent out, I explained, and I think it's also in tools and resources. You can't just install the program, but when you install SQL Server, you have to install a component called the database engine. That's the server itself. So the way to check if SQL Server is running on your machine, if you're on Windows, if you search for services, and you sort them alphabetically, SQL Server, when you install the database engine, this means the database server runs automatically on startup. So you can see here, I have a whole bunch of services, and the top one says SQL Server. The status is running, and my startup type is automatic. So every time I boot into Windows, SQL Server is running for me. If you want to run your database locally, you need to have this service running. So that means installing the database engine component. Sometimes it happens that we run the install and we forget to check off the database engine component. If that happens, the solution, run the installer again and make sure you check off, you click modify your installation, and you have to check the database engine component. That will add this service to your list of Windows services. This is only going to work for Windows users. If you're on a Mac, you don't have the ability to run a local SQL Server database. So once my service is running, I'm going to open up Management Studio. Now, I did create a database already last week. But I'm going to create another one. So in this window that pops up, I guess I should. In this window that pops up in SQL Server, it asks for the server name. So I've got a whole bunch of servers I use. At the very bottom, there's an option that says Browse for More. And then the first tab is Local Server. If I expand Database Engine, it shows me my computer name, or it may say local. So I'm going to use my local server. I'm going to click OK. And then depending on how you install the SQL Server, if you just used all the defaults, the default authentication type locally is Windows. So you can just leave it at that. When I set mine up, I set it up to use SQL Server authentication. So that's a username and password. Okay, thanks, Braden. Or if you send it to me, yeah, if you want to post it in the chat. So then I'm going to connect to my server here. And once I'm connected, I can see my server down in the Object Explorer window. And if I expand the databases, I can create a new database here. So I created the beer store last week. I'm actually going to delete it. And I'll recreate it. So in databases, I can just choose new database, give it a name with no spaces, and I've got an empty database. If I expand tables, it's going to be empty. There are no tables here yet. So this is creating it locally. So for my beer store, I'm probably going to run this locally. I'll create one on Azure as well, but my app's going to run much faster if I'm working locally. So here's our local setup. I've kind of explained these steps that I just went through. And these slides are on, this slide deck is on D2L for you. Your second option, which you don't need to do for your beer store app, but you will want to do for your assignment, is setting up a database on Azure. So I'm going to go into the Azure portal. My options may be a little different than yours because I don't have a student account, or I've got a different version of a student account. But I'm going to go through this whole process. So I'm going to go to the Azure portal first. So if you are out of Azure credits, if you signed into the Azure portal with your Georgian account, you could then sign in with your Lakehead account, create a new account, new Azure for Students account, or vice versa. So I'm going to go here to, I'm not even sure I'm in the right account. I'm going to go to SQL databases and I'm going to create a new database. So at default, it says my subscription is Azure for Students. I'm going to create a new resource group. If your Azure portal is blank, you'll need to do this. I'll call this, my resource group will be Tuesday. So that way I can group my database and my web application together. So I've got to give my database a name. I'll call it Beer Store. And then I have to create a new server. Now this part is important. It's asking you to create your own server name along with the username and password. You need to put these credentials in a separate file because there's no way to retrieve your credentials if you lose them. You have to reset them. So I always like to put these in a file. So I'll call my server name Beer Store. Okay, I'll call it Rich Beer Store. I'll give it a login, so, and a password. So I'll put some notes on, I'll make a note of my credentials. And then, so I'll click OK. That'll create my database server. Now I'm going to click configure. I don't think you need to do this because my plan is a little different from yours. I'm going to configure it. Yeah, this defaults for me to this general purpose. I just need a basic, so I'm going to pick the basic option. I think you'll have a free tier. And then I'm going to review and create it. So this is going to set up a server and create a database with the name and credentials that I've just set up. So this takes a few minutes to run. Once the database is set up, we're going to need to make a configuration change to it, and then I should be able to connect to it in Management Studio. So we'll just go through this process, takes a few minutes, and then we will take a break. Okay, so the instructions are basically here. Go to the Azure portal, create a new SQL server. You need to create the server, database name, and credentials, and make sure you don't lose those credentials because we're going to need them in order to connect both through Management Studio as well as in Visual Studio with our web application. So I'm going to let this run. It's created the server, and now it's actually creating the database inside of my server. So these servers are virtual servers. So no one will have access to your servers except for you. Okay, so my deployment is complete now. I'm going to go to the resource. So I'm going to try to connect to my database in Management Studio first. So here's my server name. I'm going to need this, so I'm going to copy it. And I'm going to come to Management Studio. And I'm going to expand here under Database Engine, under Local Groups. I'm going to choose New Server Registration. And I'm going to enter the credentials to my Azure server. So I'm going to paste the server in. I'm going to choose SQL Server Authentication. And I'm going to enter the username and password that I just created in the portal. I'm going to click Remember Password. And well, I can just leave this as the server name, or I can give it an alias. So I'm going to test this. I'm going to try to connect now through Management Studio. So I'll click Test. And I get this error. My client IP address is not allowed. To enable access, use the Azure portal to create a firewall rule for this IP address. So it recognizes the database and authenticates me, but it's saying remote access is disabled by default. So I'm going to go back to the Azure portal. And in the middle here, I have this button of the toolbar that says Set Server Firewall. So what I'm going to do is scroll down here in the firewall settings, and I'm going to create a rule called all with my start IP and my end IP. I could just add my current IP address, but if my IP address changes, I'm not going to have access. So the easiest thing is just to allow any IP address so long as the user has the right username and password. This may not be ideal for security purposes, but it will suit our purposes for now. So under firewall settings, create a rule. You can give it any name you want. The starting IP of all zeros and an ending IP of all 255. And then I'm going to click the Save button up near the top left. And the portal will tell me it's updated the rules. And now we can see I have a rule called all that I could edit or delete from zeros to 255. So I'll go back, and now I'm going to try testing my connection again. Now it succeeds. So you have to remember that step of the firewall rule. If you don't, you won't be able to connect to it. So then I'm going to save this. And now if I double click my server, you can see it's much slower connecting to Azure. So here's my database, and here's my empty beer store database on the server. So I've got two versions of the database now. They're both empty. Here's my Azure version. And here is my local version. The local one responds immediately. The Azure database has some lag to it. So I've put in these instructions in the slide deck for you to reference, because you're going to need to go through this process again in setting up the database for your assignment. Okay. And including creating the firewall rule. So it's not critical you create a beer store database. In fact, probably not a great idea. If you have SQL Server running locally, run the beer store locally. It will run more quickly and it won't use your Azure credits. If you don't have SQL Server running locally, you can use Azure for your beer store. Okay, it's 3 o'clock. So let's take a pause here. I'm going to step away for a few minutes and we will resume at 10 after 3.